Altec Lansing had more products in recording studios worldwide than every other manufacturer combined. Their speakers mixed Sgt. Peppers. Their horns carried Woodstock. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences adopted their voice of the theater as the standard for how American movies should sound. Then, piece by piece, it was taken apart. A conglomerate loaded the company with debt it didn't owe. A car stereo company called Sparkomatic bought the consumer brand and put it on plastic computer speakers. A corporate parent closed the last American factory and sold the tooling for scrap. 3 more owners in 7 years, $166 million to $18 million to $17.5 million at a bankruptcy auction. The name is still alive. It's on waterproof Bluetooth speakers now, made in China by a company that also manufactures children's toys, sold at Walmart for $30. This is the story of how a group of telephone engineers built the sound of American life from a $1 purchase in 1937, and how a long chain of transactions, each one reasonable, each one legal, turned a 60-year legacy of craft into a trademark on a box. Not through a single catastrophe, through the quiet arithmetic of people who knew the price of a brand, but not the cost of building one. The story starts with a death sentence. In 1936, AT&T's Electrical Research Products Division, ERPI, was ordered by federal antitrust regulators to dissolve itself. 295 of the most skilled audio engineers in America were about to lose their jobs. The sound systems they'd installed in over 2,000 movie theaters from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon, would have nobody to service them. Western Electric, the manufacturing giant behind it all, had held a near monopoly on theater sound since Al Jolson opened his mouth in The Jazz Singer in 1927. RCA threatened Sherman Act action. Stanley K. Olden brought suit. By 1936, the monopoly was being broken up, and the men who'd built it were being told to go home. What happened next was either the boldest act of corporate rescue in American audio history or the most improbable. A group of young ERPI engineers decided they'd rather own the wreckage than walk away from it. George Carrington, a quiet, methodical engineer with a gift for loudspeaker design, became vice president and eventually president. L.W. Mike Conroe took the first presidency. H.M. Walter Bessie handled the treasury. Bert Sanford Jr. rounded out the leadership. 3 unnamed Wall Street investors put up the financing. Together, they bought the entire ERPI service operation. The purchase price was $1. For that dollar, they got $23,499.66 in assets, 295 employees trained by Bell Telephone Laboratories, and a consent decree that specifically prohibited them from manufacturing or selling any audio equipment whatsoever. They could service what Western Electric had built. That was all. They named their company Altec Service, Altec being shorthand for All Technical. Industry observers gave them 2 years before bankruptcy. Among the founders was a man named Alvis A. Ward, a Texas A&M electrical engineering graduate who'd worked for Bell Telephone in Houston. Ward had seen his first sound movie in 1927, the same year the technology arrived, and immediately transferred to Western Electric's theater installation division. Over the next decade, he personally installed sound systems in every movie theater in East Texas, 1 county seat at a time. He knew the projectionists by name, knew which theater owners paid on time, knew which small-town movie houses needed the equipment most. Ward would go on to serve as Altec's president and chairman for nearly 4 decades, outlasting every other founder, a living bridge between the company's origin and its golden age. But Altec Services' survival depended on something the consent decree didn't anticipate: a partnership with a man whose name would become more famous than any of theirs, a man whose genius was matched only by his capacity for self-destruction. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. James Bullough Lansing was born James Martini on January 14, 1902, in Greenridge, Illinois, a coal country hamlet in Macoupin County, population barely worth counting. He was the 9th of 14 children. His father Henry worked as a coal mining engineer. The family wasn't poor exactly, but 14 children in rural Illinois at the turn of the century left little room for luxury. What James had instead of comfort was aptitude, mechanical aptitude so pronounced it frightened people. At 12 years old, he built a radio transmitter in the family home. Not a crystal set. A transmitter, powerful enough to interfere with U.S. naval radio operations at the Great Lakes Naval Center, roughly 60 miles away. The Navy sent investigators. A 12-year-old boy in coal country had jammed military communications with equipment he'd assembled from scavenged parts. He never attended college. Instead, he taught himself calculus, magnetic theory, electrical network design, and radio engineering from books and from tearing things apart to see how they worked. Everything he needed to know, he taught himself. Everything he didn't need, he ignored. He was, by every account, a profoundly difficult man. People who worked with him described someone who swung between short bursts of exhilarating enthusiasm, periods where he'd work around the clock, charming investors, sketching designs, solving problems no one else could approach, and long grinding stretches of depression so severe he'd sleep on factory sofas for days, barely speaking, irritable and unreachable. He could take command of a boardroom with technical knowledge and personal magnetism. He could also vanish into himself for weeks, a genius at building things, a catastrophe at sustaining them. In 1927, Lansing and a partner named Ken Decker founded the Lansing Manufacturing Company in Los Angeles. It was a modest operation, a small workshop where Lansing designed and built loudspeaker components, while Decker managed the finances, negotiated with suppliers, and kept the creditors at a bearable distance. Decker was everything Lansing wasn't: organized, financially literate, patient with the grinding administrative realities of running a manufacturing business. He handled the money. Lansing handled the sound. The partnership worked precisely because neither man could have succeeded alone, and both of them knew it. Their breakthrough came through Hollywood. Douglas Shearer, head of the sound department at MGM Studios and brother of the actress Norma Shearer, was hunting for loudspeaker technology worthy of a new generation of talking pictures. The speakers Western Electric had been supplying worked, but Shearer wanted something better. Wider frequency range, more power, cinema-scale sound that could fill a 2,000-seat palace without distortion. He enlisted physicist John K. Hilliard and a young Caltech PhD named John F. Blackburn. Together with Lansing, they designed and built the Shearer horn, a revolutionary two-way theater loudspeaker system that won the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Scientific and Technical Award in 1937. The Shearer horn was the first loudspeaker designed from the ground up for the specific demands of motion picture exhibition. Nothing like it had existed before. Lansing followed it with the Lansing Iconic in 1937, a compact two-way monitor that became the first dedicated recording studio monitor ever manufactured. Les Paul used one. The Iconic wasn't just a product. It was a category. Before it, studios mixed records on whatever speakers happened to be in the room. After it, they mixed on monitors designed to tell the truth about sound. Then Ken Decker was killed. An airplane crash in 1939, flying on Army Air Corps reserve maneuvers. The man who kept the books, who talked the creditors down, who translated Lansing's genius into a functioning business, gone. Without Decker's steadying hand, Lansing Manufacturing hemorrhaged money. Lansing himself couldn't manage it. He didn't know how. By 1941, the company was down to 19 employees and sinking fast. And that's when the two broken halves found each other. Altec Service, barred from manufacturing, needed someone who could build. Lansing Manufacturing, drowning in debt, needed someone who could pay. John Hilliard, who'd worked with both organizations on the Shearer Horn project, brokered the marriage. On December 4th, 1941, 3 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Altec Service purchased Lansing Manufacturing for $50,000 in cash. The combined entity was named the Altec Lansing Corporation. Their first headquarters at 6900 McKinley Avenue in Los Angeles was described in a later corporate history with a candor unusual for the genre. A hole in the wall. Packing cases served as office desks. 25 people on the entire payroll. Within 72 hours, America would be at war, and these 25 people in their hole in the wall would be asked to build things the country had never needed before. The war changed everything. The U.S. Navy contracted Altec Lansing to develop magnetic airborne detection equipment, MAD gear, an airborne submarine hunting system built in collaboration with Geophysical Service Inc., a Texas company that would later become Texas Instruments. The work was classified. The stakes were existential. German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping at a rate that threatened the entire Atlantic supply chain. Altec's engineers designed detection systems sensitive enough to locate a submarine's magnetic signature from a patrol aircraft. It was the most technically demanding work anyone in the company had ever attempted, and it forged a team of engineers whose skills went far beyond anything theater sound had required. But the war's most important gift to Altec Lansing was accidental. George Carrington, always watching for the next opportunity, noticed that the high-energy magnetic material called Alnico 5, an alloy of aluminum, nickel, and cobalt that was critical to the MAD equipment, had properties that could revolutionize loudspeaker design. The theater speakers of the era used field coil magnets, fragile, power-hungry electromagnets that required a constant electrical current to generate their magnetic field. If the power flickered, the speaker died. Alnico 5 could replace them with permanent magnets, lighter, more powerful, and virtually indestructible. A wartime weapons program had inadvertently invented the future of professional sound. Carrington recognized it. Nobody else did. That was the kind of engineer he was, the man who saw what a thing could become, not just what it was. The result was the Model 604 duplex, introduced in 1944. A 15-inch coaxial loudspeaker with an integrated compression driver mounted concentrically at its center. Two transducers in one cabinet, covering the full audible frequency range from a single point source. The idea came from an LA audio dealer named Art Crawford, who'd been frustrated by the phase problems created when woofers and tweeters were mounted separately. George Carrington authorized the project. John Hilliard designed the crossover network that divided the signal between the low-frequency cone and the high-frequency compression driver. James Lansing supervised the tooling, the manufacturing, the painstaking process of turning a concept into a product that could be built repeatably. 4 men, 4 overlapping disciplines, one speaker that would define how the world heard recorded music for the next 30 years. When the war ended, Altec pivoted to the thing they understood best. In 1945, John Hilliard began developing what would become the company's most iconic product line, the Voice of the Theater, VOTT, a modular two-way loudspeaker system designed specifically for motion picture exhibition. The bass was handled by the Model 515 woofer, the first low-frequency transducer to use flat edge-wound wire in its voice coil, a design choice that delivered efficiency numbers no competitor could match. The high frequencies were handled by the Model 288 compression driver, a cast aluminum horn-loaded device that could throw intelligible dialogue and music to the back row of a 2,000-seat movie palace without strain. Alvis Ward formally announced the Voice of the Theater in 1947. Within 8 years, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences had adopted it as the industry standard for theatrical playback. Not a recommendation, not a preference, the standard. If you operated a first-run movie house in America and you wanted the Academy's seal of approval, you installed Altec. In 1946, Altec acquired Peerless, one of the country's premier transformer manufacturers, adding amplifier design and manufacturing capability to their loudspeaker dominance. The same year, they introduced the Giant Voice PA system for the National Civil Defense Warning System, the sirens and loudspeakers that would warn American cities if Soviet bombers were inbound. They developed the first transistorized repeater amplifier for the telephone industry. They led the introduction of stereophonic sound into movie theaters. Each new product line expanded their reach. Each contract deepened their engineering bench. But James Lansing wasn't there to see any of it. On October 1st, 1946, the day his 5-year non-compete contract expired, he left Altec to start over. He founded Lansing Sound, Incorporated, in a small shop in Los Angeles. His partners were a lawyer named Chauncey Snow and a financial consultant named Chester L. Noble. At Carrington's insistence, to avoid a trademark conflict, Lansing renamed the company James B. Lansing Sound Inc. JBL. He threw himself into designing what he'd always designed, transducers of astonishing quality. The D130, a 15-inch speaker driver with a 4-inch voice coil, became a landmark. Leo Fender adopted it for his electric guitar amplifiers, and it defined the sound of rock and roll for a generation. But the business destroyed him. Lansing had never been able to manage money, manage people, manage the grinding daily reality of keeping a manufacturing operation solvent. Without Ken Decker, without the structure of a larger corporation, the darkness that had always shadowed him closed in. On September 24, 1949, at the age of 47, James Bullough Lansing drove to his ranch in San Marcos, California, and hanged himself from one of his avocado trees. He'd had the foresight, or the fatalism, to take out a $10,000 life insurance policy, naming his company as the beneficiary. That money was enough to keep JBL alive through the crisis. His D1000 loudspeaker made the cover of Audio Engineering magazine in January 1950. He never saw it published. The company that bore his full name would carry his engineering philosophy forward for decades. The company he'd left behind carried his surname. Both would dominate American professional audio, and eventually one would consume the other. In 1956, Altec Lansing broke ground on a modern headquarters plant at 1515 South Manchester Avenue, Anaheim, California. The location was almost comically symbolic. Directly across the street, Walt Disney's monorail glided above the trees of Tomorrowland. The factory and the theme park were neighbors, separated by a road and nothing else. Both were selling Americans the same proposition: the future engineered and built by American hands on American soil for American consumption. The factory land cost $10,500 an acre. The Anaheim plant was where Altec's products came into being. Raw materials, permanent magnets, spools of voice coil wire, sheets of cone paper, rolls of aluminum for compression driver diaphragms, cast frames, wood for cabinets, arrived at the receiving docks on the south end of the building. Finished loudspeakers, amplifiers, mixing consoles, and microphones left from the shipping bay on the north side, bound for recording studios in Hollywood, movie theaters in the Midwest, military installations overseas, and concert venues across 5 continents. But the journey between those 2 points wasn't the relentless automation of a Detroit assembly line. Altec products were built substantially by hand in a factory where the smell of solder flux and lacquer and sawdust from the cabinet shop mixed with the ozone bite of test equipment and the coffee from the break room down the hall. Each Model 604 duplex was assembled by a technician who centered the cone on the frame with a precision that instruments could measure but couldn't fully replicate, who wound the voice coil to tolerances so tight that a single misplaced turn could degrade the speaker's performance across its entire frequency range, who formed and seated the aluminum compression driver diaphragm, and then tested it by ear as much as by oscilloscope. Workers developed a haptic knowledge of the process. A veteran assembler could tap a cone with a fingertip and know from the resonance whether the suspension compliance was within specification. That kind of skill lived in the hands of the people who built the product, not in the manuals that described it. The 604 duplex became the most consequential studio monitor in the history of recorded sound. Abbey Road studios used them. So did Capitol Records in Hollywood, where Frank Sinatra and the Beach Boys recorded. American Sound Studio in Memphis, where Dusty Springfield cut Dusty in Memphis, and Elvis Presley recorded Suspicious Minds. A&R Recording in New York, Apple Records in London, Motown's Hitsville, USA in Detroit. The records mixed on Altec 604 monitors include Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Pet Sounds, What's Going On, and Born to Run. When engineers played back a take, the speakers they trusted to tell them the truth about what they'd recorded were, more often than not, Altec. Billboard magazine's 1973 International Directory of Recording Studios made the dominance quantifiable. More Altec products were installed in professional recording studios worldwide than every other manufacturer combined. The voice of the theater achieved a dominance of its own. The largest configuration, the A1, used 6 Model 515 bass drivers in a bass reflex cabinet the size of a refrigerator. The most widely deployed model was the A4, standing 9 feet tall, built for the largest movie palaces. But the workhorse was the compact A7, roughly 5 feet tall, 180 pounds, with a sensitivity rating of 103 decibels at 1 watt from 1 meter away. That sensitivity figure mattered enormously in the pre-digital age. It meant you could drive the A7 with a modest amplifier and fill a concert hall. You didn't need massive power. You needed an efficient speaker. The A7 was the most efficient professional speaker anyone had ever built. Owsley, Bear Stanley, the Grateful Dead's legendary soundman and LSD chemist, introduced the band to Altec A7s. They became the backbone of the Dead's early sound system. Bars and nightclubs across America installed them. Concert promoters rented stacks of them. Churches used them for Sunday services. School auditoriums used them for assemblies and basketball games. In Japan, the Altec A7 transcended its utilitarian function and became a cultural object, installed in the legendary jazz kissa, intimate listening cafes where audiophiles sat in near religious silence while vinyl spun through speakers that cost more than all the furniture in the room. The 604 remained in continuous production through 11 model revisions, from 1944 all the way to 1998. 54 years of unbroken manufacturing. No competitor matched that run. In 2005, the Audio Engineering Society inducted it into the Technology Hall of Fame. The voice of the theater had been inducted the year before. 2 products from one company, honored in consecutive years, for changing the way human beings heard recorded and amplified sound. No other manufacturer in the history of professional audio has received that distinction. By the early 1960s, Altec employed more than 600 people across 7 business divisions: professional sound, commercial sound, communications, microphones, consumer audio, military and government systems, and theater service. The company had developed the first transistorized repeater amplifier for the Bell telephone system, built the giant voice alert system for national civil defense, and led the introduction of stereophonic sound into American movie theaters. The word quality was spoken at Altec with what one corporate publication described as a kind of religious fervor, and the description wasn't wrong. These were people who believed that the precision of a voice coil winding was a moral question, that the frequency response of a compression driver reflected the character of the company that built it. The comedian Shelley Berman, performing on a national television broadcast when his microphone failed, shouted the line that became industry legend and the best free advertising Altec ever received: "Give me my Altec." The factory hummed 6 days a week. The parking lot filled before dawn. Across the street, the Disneyland monorail carried tourists above the trees, and the tourists sometimes looked out the windows and saw the low, clean factory building where the sound of America was being assembled, one speaker at a time, by people who'd chosen to make their living with their hands. In August 1969, a sound engineer named Bill Hanley drove a truck loaded with Altec Lansing equipment up the back roads of Sullivan County, New York, toward a dairy farm in the town of Bethel. Hanley, known in the industry as the father of festival sound, had been contracted to design a public address system for what the promoters believed would be a crowd of perhaps 100,000 people, optimistically 200,000. The permit said 50,000. The promoters hoped for more. Nobody, not the organizers, not the local police, not the farmers whose land surrounded the site, imagined 400,000. The system Hanley designed was built around Altec components: 1003B multicellular horns directing the high-frequency energy outward in a controlled pattern, Altec 2 90 compression drivers handling the upper ranges, and Altec 1 567A vacuum tube mixers at the center of the signal chain, where every microphone and instrument feed was balanced before being sent to the amplifiers. The low frequencies were handled by JBL D130 and D140 woofers, the very transducers that James Lansing had designed before his death, now sharing a stage with the company that still bore his name. For 3 days, in mud and rain, through sets by Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and The Who and Santana and Richie Havens and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the sound held. The amplifiers didn't overheat, the horns didn't crack, the mixers didn't distort. A journalist covering the festival observed afterward that only three things at Woodstock didn't fail: the water supply, the stage security, and the sound system. The Altec 1567A mixer, a rack-mounted vacuum tube unit that had been designed for permanent theater installations, turned out to be one of the most versatile pieces of live sound equipment ever built. It was at the front-of-house position when the Beatles played Shea Stadium in 1965, struggling to be heard above 55,000 screaming fans. It ran the sound at the Hollywood Bowl, the Newport Jazz Festival, the Newport Folk Festival, the Fillmore East. Jerry Garcia played through Altec Lansing 417-8C speakers, 12-inch drivers that one audio historian would later describe as one of the transducers that defined the sound of rock music in the 1970s. Carlos Santana used them too. The 417-8C had a presence in the mid-range that cut through a live mix the way a trumpet cuts through an orchestra. Not by being louder, but by being clearer. By the late 1960s, what Altec Lansing had built was something close to a monopoly on professional sound in America. If you went to the movies, you heard Altec. If you went to a concert, you almost certainly heard Altec. If you bought a record that had been mixed in any major studio in New York, Los Angeles, Nashville, Memphis, or London, it had been mixed on Altec monitors. If you walked into a neighborhood bar with a jukebox, the speakers behind the grill were likely Altec. If the President of the United States gave a speech at a military base, the PA system carrying his words was probably Altec's giant voice. The 604 duplex had been in continuous production for 25 years and would continue for another 29 through 11 model revisions, a production run that no competitor in professional audio would ever match. The voice of the theater was installed in more first-run movie theaters than all competing systems combined. The A7 was the default choice for any venue that needed to fill a room with intelligible, full-range sound from the Fillmore to the local VFW Hall. And the numbers told a story of their own. The land beneath the Anaheim factory, purchased for $10,500 an acre in 1956, was by the early 1960s worth $65,000 an acre. The workforce had grown from 25 people in a hole in the wall on McKinley Avenue to more than 600 across 7 divisions. The products were priceless. The workforce was irreplaceable. The institutional knowledge that lived in those workers' hands, the feel of a properly suspended cone, the sound of a correctly aligned compression driver, the thousand small judgments that no manual could codify, represented decades of accumulated craft that couldn't be replicated, only inherited. This was the summit, the highest point that 7 decades of accumulated engineering knowledge, handcraft precision, and institutional reputation could reach. Altec Lansing, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, was the sound of American life itself. In its theaters, its studios, its concert halls, its churches, its stadiums, its military bases, its neighborhood bars. They just didn't know it was the summit. Something had already happened that would unravel everything. And it had happened more than a decade before Woodstock, before the Billboard survey, before the land beneath the Anaheim factory was worth 6 times what they'd paid for it. In 1958, while the company was still ascending, George Carrington, the co-founder, the man who'd spotted the potential of Alnico 5 in a wartime submarine detector, the quiet engineer who'd authorized the 604 duplex and shepherded the company from a $1 purchase into a manufacturing powerhouse, sold Altec Lansing. He was ailing and tired. The buyer was a Dallas conglomerate builder named James Ling. Ling was not an audio man. He was an acquisition man, an empire man, a financial architect who'd started as an electrical contractor and leveraged his way into building Ling Temco Vout, LTV, one of the most aggressive American conglomerates of the 1960s. LTV's portfolio ranged from meatpacking to aerospace to sporting goods. Altec Lansing became another tile in the mosaic. For a while, it didn't matter much. The products were still designed in Anaheim. The engineers still determined what got built. Alvis Ward still served as president and chairman, providing the continuity that institutional memory requires. The man who'd been there since the ERPI days, who remembered what a $1 purchase felt like. LTV's restructuring in 1964 reorganized Altec into a subsidiary called LTV Ling Altec. The corporate paperwork multiplied, the reporting lines lengthened, the decisions that mattered, investment, expansion, R&D budgets, now ran through layers of management that had never soldered a voice coil or tested a compression driver's frequency response. The real damage came in the 1970s, when LTV began divesting. The divestiture didn't merely separate Altec from its parent. It loaded Altec Lansing with massive debt that had been LTV's, not Altec's, obligations generated by the conglomerate's other operations, now transferred to the audio subsidiary as a condition of the separation. Altec Lansing, a company that had earned its dominance through engineering excellence and manufacturing craft, was suddenly financially handcuffed at the precise moment when professional audio was exploding. Tour sound was becoming an industry. The musical instrument amplifier market was growing exponentially. Home hi-fi was booming. Every one of these markets was an opportunity that Altec could have pursued, that Altec's engineering talent and brand reputation gave it every right to pursue. But the R&D budgets that had produced the 604, the voice of the theater, the 1567A mixer, the giant voice, those budgets were now servicing someone else's debt. And in Northridge, California, not far from the old Lansing manufacturing shop where it had all begun, another company was watching. JBL, the company James Lansing had founded with the proceeds of his life insurance policy after he left Altec in 1946, was thriving under the ownership of Harman International. Well-financed, aggressive, technically brilliant, led by engineers who'd inherited Lansing's obsession with transducer performance, but married it to the business discipline he'd never possessed. While Altec couldn't afford to expand, JBL seized the tour sound market, the studio monitor upgrade cycle, the home speaker boom. Every market Altec was financially barred from pursuing. JBL walked into and claimed. The irony was almost too precise to bear. The troubled genius who'd hanged himself from an avocado tree in San Marcos in 1949 had left behind a company that would 3 decades later methodically devour the company that still carried his name. But that unraveling was still ahead. In the early 1970s, the name still meant something. The speakers still hung in every first-run theater. The 604 still sat in control rooms on both coasts. The A7 still filled concert halls and neighborhood bars from coast to coast. The workforce still arrived at the Anaheim plant each morning, parked in the shadow of the Disneyland monorail, and built speakers by hand. The name was still gold. It was just that the gold didn't belong to the people who'd earned it anymore. And the people who owned it now weren't in the business of making speakers. They were in the business of making deals. That's a different trade entirely, and it leads to different places. Altec even wounded itself. At the height of its studio dominance, the company replaced the legendary 604 with the 605A duplex, a redesigned version that used a less efficient magnet structure and suffered a 3 decibel sensitivity drop. 3 decibels doesn't sound like much to a civilian. To an audio engineer, it's the difference between a speaker that commands a control room and one that merely occupies it. Capitol Records, one of Altec's most prestigious accounts, replaced their 604s with JBL monitors. Other studios followed. The engineers who'd built their careers trusting Altec monitors were, for the first time, looking elsewhere. And JBL was right there, waiting, with products designed to fill the exact space Altec was vacating. That's how the summit looks in retrospect. An engineering organization producing the finest professional loudspeakers in the world, burdened with debt it didn't create, owned by people who didn't understand what they had, bleeding market share to a competitor founded by the ghost of a man who'd left their company in despair 3 decades earlier. The workers in Anaheim didn't know any of this. They came to work. They built speakers. The monorail glided past the windows. The morning shift punched in. The cones were centered. The horns were tested. The quality was still there. It was the summit, and standing on it, nobody inside those walls could see what was coming down the other side. The unraveling didn't begin with a single catastrophe. It began with arithmetic. When LTV divested Altec Lansing in the mid-1970s, the separation agreement transferred corporate debt onto the audio company's balance sheet, obligations generated by Ling Temco Vought's other operations, debts Altec had never incurred, now owed by a loudspeaker manufacturer that had never needed to borrow. The company that had earned its dominance through engineering precision was suddenly carrying a financial burden designed for a conglomerate 10 times its size. The timing could not have been worse. The 1970s were the decade when professional audio exploded. Tour sound became a genuine industry. Bands that had once played through borrowed PA columns were now hiring dedicated sound companies with semi-trucks full of equipment. The musical instrument amplifier market was booming. Home hi-fi was in its golden age, and every suburban living room in America seemed to want bigger speakers, better receivers, more watts. Each of these markets was an opportunity Altec Lansing should have owned. Their engineering talent was the deepest in the industry. Their brand name was the most respected. But you can't finance expansion when your cash flow is servicing someone else's loans. Altec watched the boom happen from behind a chain-link fence of debt they hadn't created. JBL did not watch. Under the ownership of Harman International, with access to capital that Altec could only envy, JBL moved into every market Altec couldn't defend. The studio monitor business went first. Altec compounded the competitive problem with a self-inflicted wound that veterans of the industry still discuss with something close to disbelief. At the height of its studio dominance, the company discontinued the Model 604 in favor of the 605A duplex. The 605A used a cheaper, less efficient magnet structure. The result was a 3 decibel sensitivity drop, a number that might mean nothing to a civilian but that represented, to the recording engineers who depended on these monitors, a fundamental degradation of the tool they trusted most. Capitol Records in Hollywood, one of Altec's most prestigious accounts, the studio where Frank Sinatra and the Beach Boys had recorded, replaced their Altec monitors with JBL. Other studios followed. By the mid-1970s, JBL had overtaken Altec as the monitor of choice in most professional recording studios. The crown that Billboard's 1973 directory had documented was gone within 5 years. Then JBL took the theaters. In the early 1980s, George Lucas's THX program established new technical standards for cinema sound reproduction. JBL positioned itself as the THX certified standard. Altec, the company whose voice of the theater had been the Academy's official standard since 1955, couldn't invest in the redesign and certification process that THX compliance required. The last fortress fell. By 1980, one informed observer noted, Altec had ceded dominance to JBL in every professional and consumer audio market except legacy cinema installations. Quality was slipping, too. JBL had been purchasing Altec 604 duplex drivers for use in URI time-aligned studio monitors, a product that paired Altec speakers with URI's proprietary crossover and time alignment technology. By the early 1980s, JBL was reportedly rejecting roughly 80% of the duplex drivers Altec shipped. 8 out of every 10 speakers failed to meet the quality standard that Altec itself had once defined. The hands that built the product hadn't changed, but the resources behind those hands, the quality control infrastructure, the testing equipment, the materials budget that allowed you to reject a substandard magnet or a cone with an imperfect surround, had been hollowed out by years of debt service and deferred investment. The engineers knew what was happening. They could see the reject rates climbing. They couldn't fix it without money that was being sent to LTV's creditors instead of to the production floor. The company that had once boasted that the word quality was spoken at Altec with religious fervor was now shipping product that its own biggest customer returned 4 times out of 5. That's not a quality problem. That's a company dying from the inside. In a desperate attempt to retire the LTV inherited obligations, Altec sold the Anaheim factory, the plant at 1515 South Manchester Avenue, next to Disneyland, where 600 workers had built the sound of American life for a quarter-century. The land alone was worth a fortune. Those acres, purchased at $10,500 each in 1956, had appreciated to $65,000 per acre by the early 1960s, and by the late 1970s were worth substantially more. The company took the money and relocated to Oklahoma City, where operating costs were lower, where the workforce was cheaper, where office space and factory floor could be had for a fraction of California prices. The move made financial sense in the short term. In every other term, it was a retreat. The engineering culture that had produced the 604, The voice of the theater and the giant voice had been rooted in Southern California. In proximity to Hollywood, to the recording studios, to the concert venues, to the customer base that had made Altec the standard. Oklahoma City was good for the balance sheet. It was 1,000 miles from the people who used the product, and it wasn't enough. In September 1983, the Altec Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company that had been purchased for $1 in 1937, that had bought a failing loudspeaker manufacturer for $50,000 3 days before Pearl Harbor, that had built the speakers for Woodstock and equipped more recording studios than every competitor combined, was broke. Not because it had built bad products, not because the market had disappeared, because a conglomerate builder in Dallas had loaded it with debt that belonged to someone else, and the weight of that debt had crushed it. What followed the bankruptcy was not a rescue. It was a dismemberment, carried out over 16 years by a succession of owners, each one stripping a different layer of the company away, each one believing, or claiming to believe, that what they were doing would save what was left. In 1984, Galton Industries Inc. purchased Altec's Sound Products division out of Chapter 11. They got the tooling, the inventories, the patents, and the name. They did not get the theater service business. That was sold separately to J. Bruce Waddell, the head of Altec's service division, and comptroller Robert V. Gandolfi, who established ASC Technical Services in Richardson, Texas, and continued servicing the thousands of theater installations Altec had built over 5 decades. It was the first cut. The company that had been founded as a service organization was now severed from its service operation. Galton formed a new Altec Lansing Corporation, headquartered at 10,500 West Reno Avenue in Oklahoma City, the former University Sound Factory. They shut down the home audio and car audio divisions to focus exclusively on professional sound. Within roughly 11 months, Galton itself was acquired by Mark IV Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate based in Amherst, near Buffalo, New York. Mark IV was led by Chairman and CEO Salvatore H. Alfiero and President Clement R. Arison. They were not audio men. They were conglomerate men, acquisition specialists who operated across multiple industries, buying companies the way other people bought inventory, in bulk for leverage, with an eye toward synergies that looked better on paper than they worked in practice. The acquisition gave Mark IV control of both Altec Lansing and Electro Voice, two of the most storied names in professional audio, now housed under the same corporate roof. In theory, the combined operation could have been formidable. Two legendary brands with complementary product lines, sharing manufacturing resources and distribution networks. In practice, according to people who were inside the organization, something very different happened. Todd W. White, a former Altec Lansing professional contractor who has maintained the unofficial Altec Lansing homepage since 1998 as an act of preservation and witness, documented allegations from insiders that Electro Voice's management systematically undermined Altec within the Mark IV corporate structure. Resources were directed to EV product development. Altec R&D was starved of funding. Sales support for Altec products was deprioritized. Engineering talent was redirected. The internal competition wasn't managed. It was rigged. The goal, according to these accounts, wasn't to build both brands into a dominant force. It was to eliminate the internal competitor by attrition, letting Altec wither while EV absorbed its market share. White's summary, informed by years of first-hand observation and insider testimony, was blunt. Even burdened with LTV's debt, even starved of resources from within, Altec simply refused to die. The product line was that strong. The dealer network was that loyal. The customer base, built across 5 decades of delivering on promises, would not let go. It took something more deliberate, more patient, and more ruthless to finish the job. While Mark IV was managing the professional division, the consumer brand was following a parallel path, one that would ultimately prove more consequential. In 1984, when the original Altec Corporation went into Chapter 11, a company called Sparkomatic Corporation acquired the consumer audio rights to the Altec Lansing name. Sparkomatic had been founded in 1953 in Milford, Pennsylvania, a small town in Pike County in the Pocono Mountains, by Ed Almquist and Jonas H. Anschel. After Almquist departed in 1966, Anschel took full control. His son, Edward Anschel, born in 1939 in Port Jervis, New York, a Penn State graduate, became president in 1970 and added chairman and CEO in 1980. Sparkomatic was known for one thing: cheap car stereos. Their products were sold at Kmart and Walmart. Annual revenue was roughly $100 million, respectable for the category, but carrying zero prestige in audio circles. The Sparkomatic name meant budget. It meant adequate. It meant the car stereo you installed when you couldn't afford a Pioneer or a Kenwood. This was the company that now owned the right to put the Altec Lansing name on consumer products. By December 1986, a formal licensing arrangement with Mark IV was complete. Sparkomatic received all consumer rights to the Altec Lansing brand, while Mark IV retained the professional audio rights. Sparkomatic also acquired the original specification sheets and engineering drawings. They moved operations to their headquarters in Milford, and then they did something that would define the brand's future more than any product Altec had ever built in Anaheim or Oklahoma City. In 1991, Sparkomatic designed and manufactured the first purpose-built multimedia computer speaker. Not a hi-fi speaker repurposed for a desktop. Not a pair of headphones bundled into a box. A product designed from scratch for the specific use case of sitting next to a beige IBM-compatible personal computer on a particle board desk in a home office or college dorm room. The timing was extraordinary. The personal computer revolution was creating a market for audio peripherals that hadn't existed 5 years earlier, and nobody else had built a dedicated product for it. IBM, Dell, Compaq, Hewlett-Packard, Gateway, every major PC manufacturer needed speakers to bundle with their systems, and Sparkomatic's computer speakers, carrying the Altec Lansing badge, became the default OEM choice. The business boomed. Revenue soared. For a brief window in the mid-1990s, the Altec Lansing name was once again ubiquitous in American audio. Not in theaters and recording studios, but on desks, in cubicles, in dorm rooms, sitting next to monitors displaying Windows 95. In 1992, Sparkomatic formally renamed itself Altec Lansing Technologies, Inc. The car stereo company had consumed the legendary audio brand's identity whole. The transformation was complete. The products that now carried the Altec Lansing name were clean sheet designs. They bore no engineering relationship to the 604 duplex, the voice of the theater, or any product that had ever emerged from the Anaheim or Oklahoma City factories. They were plastic enclosures with small, inexpensive drivers, designed to be manufactured at the lowest possible cost and sold in volume to OEM computer companies. They were adequate for their purpose. Some were genuinely good for the category, but they were not Altec Lansing speakers in any sense that the name had historically carried. They were Sparkomatic speakers wearing an Altec Lansing badge. The name was no longer a guarantee of engineering excellence. It was a marketing asset, and it was being spent. Meanwhile, the professional division's death continued on its own timeline. Around 1994, Mark IV Industries sold its audio division, including both Altec Lansing Professional and Electro Voice, to Greenwich Street Capital Partners, a New York investment firm. In 1997, Greenwich merged the audio assets with Telex Communications, based in Minneapolis. Telex was a communications equipment company. They made intercoms, wireless microphone systems, headsets. They understood audio as a commodity, not a craft. Telex consolidated all manufacturing into Minnesota. The Oklahoma City factory, the building at 10,500 West Reno Avenue, the last physical location on Earth where genuine Altec Lansing professional loudspeakers were designed and assembled by people who understood what they were building, people who'd learned the craft from the people who'd learned it before them, was closed around 1998. The tooling, the jigs, the original engineering drawings by John Hilliard and the team that had designed the voice of the theater, the manufacturing fixtures that had been used to build 604 duplex monitors and 515 woofers and 288 compression drivers for more than 50 years. All of it was declared surplus. Telex had no use for it. They made intercoms. Then came the final act. In May and December of 2000, Telex formally terminated the Altec Lansing professional division entirely. All remaining professional audio work was consolidated under the Electro Voice banner. An executive named Alan Shirley delivered the announcement. The Altec Lansing brand name had been sold to Altec Lansing Technologies, the former Sparkomatic, the computer speaker company in Milford, Pennsylvania. But what ALT purchased was only the brand names, Altec Lansing, Voice of the Theater, Voice of the Highway, and eventually Duplex. They did not buy the actual company. They did not buy the designs. They did not buy the products. They did not buy any physical manufacturing capability. They bought a collection of words, words that had once meant the most respected professional audio engineering operation in the world, and that now meant a line of computer speakers sold at Best Buy. Todd White, who had watched the entire process from inside the contractor network, wrote the epitaph that the audio industry would remember. When Electro Voice couldn't kill Altec by building better products, they asked themselves what they were going to do. Then the answer came loud and clear: buy it, then kill it. What followed the bankruptcy was not a rescue. It was a dismemberment, carried out over 16 years by a succession of owners, each one stripping a different layer of the company away, each one believing, or claiming to believe, that what they were doing would save what was left. In 1984, Gulton Industries Inc. purchased Altec's Sound Products division out of Chapter 11. They got the tooling, the inventories, the patents, and the name. They did not get the theater service business. That was sold separately to J. Bruce Waddell, the head of Altec's service division, and comptroller Robert V. Gandolfi, who established ASC Technical Services in Richardson, Texas, and continued servicing the thousands of theater installations Altec had built over 5 decades. It was the first cut. The company that had been founded as a service organization was now severed from its service operation. Gulton formed a new Altec Lansing Corporation, headquartered at 10,500 West Reno Avenue in Oklahoma City, the former University Sound Factory. They shut down the home audio and car audio divisions to focus exclusively on professional sound. Within roughly 11 months, Gulton itself was acquired by Mark IV Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate based in Amherst, near Buffalo, New York. Mark IV was led by Chairman and CEO Salvatore H. Alfiero and President Clement R. Arison. They were not audio men. They were conglomerate men, acquisition specialists who operated across multiple industries, buying companies the way other people bought inventory, in bulk, for leverage, with an eye toward synergies that looked better on paper than they worked in practice. The acquisition gave Mark IV control of both Altec Lansing and Electro Voice, two of the most storied names in professional audio, now housed under the same corporate roof. In theory, the combined operation could have been formidable, two legendary brands with complementary product lines, sharing manufacturing resources and distribution networks. In practice, according to people who were inside the organization, something very different happened. Todd W. White, a former Altec Lansing professional contractor who has maintained the unofficial Altec Lansing homepage since 1998 as an act of preservation and witness, documented allegations from insiders that Electro Voice's management systematically undermined Altec within the Mark IV corporate structure. Resources were directed to EV product development. Altec R&D was starved of funding. Sales support for Altec products was deprioritized. Engineering talent was redirected. The internal competition wasn't managed. It was rigged. The goal, according to these accounts, wasn't to build both brands into a dominant force. It was to eliminate the internal competitor by attrition, letting Altec wither while EV absorbed its market share. White's summary, informed by years of first-hand observation and insider testimony, was blunt. Even burdened with LTV's debt, even starved of resources from within, Altec simply refused to die. The product line was that strong. The dealer network was that loyal. The customer base, built across 5 decades of delivering on promises, would not let go. It took something more deliberate, more patient, and more ruthless to finish the job. While Mark IV was managing the professional division, the consumer brand was following a parallel path, one that would ultimately prove more consequential. In 1984, When the original Altec Corporation went into Chapter 11, a company called Sparkomatic Corporation acquired the consumer audio rights to the Altec Lansing name. Sparkomatic had been founded in 1953 in Milford, Pennsylvania, a small town in Pike County in the Pocono Mountains, by Ed Almquist and Jonas H. Anschel. After Almquist departed in 1966, Anschel took full control. His son Edward Anschel, born in 1939 in Port Jervis, New York, a Penn State graduate, became president in 1970 and added chairman and CEO in 1980. Sparkomatic was known for one thing: cheap car stereos. Their products were sold at Kmart and Walmart. Annual revenue was roughly $100 million, respectable for the category but carrying zero prestige in audio circles. The Sparkomatic name meant budget. It meant adequate. It meant the car stereo you installed when you couldn't afford a Pioneer or a Kenwood. This was the company that now owned the right to put the Altec Lansing name on consumer products. By December 1986, a formal licensing arrangement with Mark IV was complete. Sparkomatic received all consumer rights to the Altec Lansing brand, while Mark IV retained the professional audio rights. Sparkomatic also acquired the original specification sheets and engineering drawings. They moved operations to their headquarters in Milford, and then they did something that would define the brand's future more than any product Altec had ever built in Anaheim or Oklahoma City. In 1991, Sparkomatic designed and manufactured the first purpose-built multimedia computer speaker. Not a hi-fi speaker repurposed for a desktop. Not a pair of headphones bundled into a box. A product designed from scratch for the specific use case of sitting next to a beige IBM-compatible personal computer on a particle board desk in a home office or college dorm room. The timing was extraordinary. The personal computer revolution was creating a market for audio peripherals that hadn't existed 5 years earlier, and nobody else had built a dedicated product for it. IBM, Dell, Compaq, Hewlett-Packard, Gateway, every major PC manufacturer needed speakers to bundle with their systems, and Sparkomatic's computer speakers, carrying the Altec Lansing badge, became the default OEM choice. The business boomed, revenue soared. For a brief window in the mid-1990s, the Altec Lansing name was once again ubiquitous in American audio, not in theaters and recording studios, but on desks, in cubicles, in dorm rooms, sitting next to monitors displaying Windows 95. In 1992, Sparkomatic formally renamed itself Altec Lansing Technologies, Inc. The car stereo company had consumed the legendary audio brand's identity whole. The transformation was complete. The products that now carried the Altec Lansing name were clean sheet designs. They bore no engineering relationship to the 604 duplex, the voice of the theater, or any product that had ever emerged from the Anaheim or Oklahoma City factories. They were plastic enclosures with small, inexpensive drivers designed to be manufactured at the lowest possible cost and sold in volume to OEM computer companies. They were adequate for their purpose. Some were genuinely good for the category, but they were not Altec Lansing speakers in any sense that the name had historically carried. They were Sparkomatic speakers wearing an Altec Lansing badge. The name was no longer a guarantee of engineering excellence. It was a marketing asset, and it was being spent. Meanwhile, the professional division's death continued on its own timeline. Around 1994, Mark IV Industries sold its audio division, including both Altec Lansing Professional and Electro Voice, to Greenwich Street Capital Partners, a New York investment firm. In 1997, Greenwich merged the audio assets with Telex Communications, based in Minneapolis. Telex was a communications equipment company. They made intercoms, wireless microphone systems, headsets. They understood audio as a commodity, not a craft. Telex consolidated all manufacturing into Minnesota. The Oklahoma City factory, the building at 10,500 West Reno Avenue, the last physical location on Earth where genuine Altec Lansing, professional loudspeakers were designed and assembled by people who understood what they were building, people who'd learned the craft from the people who'd learned it before them, was closed around 1998. The tooling, the jigs, the original engineering drawings by John Hilliard, and the team that had designed the voice of the theater, the manufacturing fixtures that had been used to build 604 duplex monitors and 515 woofers and 288 compression drivers for more than 50 years. All of it was declared surplus. Telex had no use for it. They made intercoms. Then came the final act. In May and December of 2000, Telex formally terminated the Altec Lansing professional division entirely. All remaining professional audio work was consolidated under the Electro Voice banner. An executive named Alan Shirley delivered the announcement. The Altec Lansing brand name had been sold to Altec Lansing Technologies, the former Sparkomatic, the computer speaker company in Milford, Pennsylvania. But what ALT purchased was only the brand names: Altec Lansing, Voice of the Theater, Voice of the Highway, and eventually Duplex. They did not buy the actual company. They did not buy the designs. They did not buy the products. They did not buy any physical manufacturing capability. They bought a collection of words. Words that had once meant the most respected professional audio engineering operation in the world, and that now meant a line of computer speakers sold at Best Buy. Todd White, who had watched the entire process from inside the contractor network, wrote the epitaph that the audio industry would remember. When Electro Voice couldn't kill Altec by building better products, they asked themselves what they were going to do. Then the answer came loud and clear: buy it, then kill it. Not everyone walked away. Bill Hanishak worked at Altec Lansing from 1980 until Telex closed the Oklahoma City factory around 1998, when the equipment was declared surplus. The tooling, the jigs, the original engineering drawings, the manufacturing fixtures that had been used to build 604 duplex monitors, voice of the theater systems, compression drivers, and woofers for decades. Hanishak bought all of it. Not some of it. All of it. He established Great Plains Audio at 7127 Northwest 3rd Street in Oklahoma City, just blocks from the shuttered factory, and began manufacturing genuine replacement components and acoustically equivalent new loudspeakers using original Altec tooling and processes. The company's phone number is still listed: 405-789-0221. In 2018, Francisco Gileda purchased shares in the company, becoming CEO, while Hanishak continued as Chief Technology Officer. The company was rebranded Great Plains Acoustics. They are the last people on Earth building loudspeakers from the original Altec Lansing tooling, using the original Altec Lansing methods, in the same city where the last Altec factory operated. They don't have the name. Sakar International has the name. They have something the name can't buy: the actual capability. Bill Hayes, the former head of Altec's acoustic department, took a different path. He established Micromic Labs at 1537 West Chris Place in Anaheim, California, back where the Anaheim factory once stood, in the shadow of the Disneyland monorail that still glides past, repairing and restoring vintage Altec microphones. Todd W. White, the former contractor who'd watched the dismemberment from the inside, launched the unofficial Altec Lansing homepage in 1998 and has maintained it ever since as a clearinghouse for parts, service information, and historical preservation. He spent more than 25 years documenting what the company was, how it died, and where the pieces landed. In June 2022, two former Altec Lansing Technologies executives, James Pedranti and Gary Pomes, organized a reunion at Log Tavern Brewing in Milford, Pennsylvania, the small Pocono Mountains town where Sparkomatic had been headquartered. More than 50 former employees attended, people who'd built computer speakers for Dell and Hewlett-Packard, people who'd tried to maintain engineering standards as the brand was passed from owner to owner, people who'd been laid off when the company was sold for a fraction of its previous purchase price. They gathered in a brew pub and remembered what it had been like to work for a company called Altec Lansing. Even when the Altec Lansing they worked for bore almost no resemblance to the one that had built the voice of the theater. The vintage market delivers its own verdict: a pair of Altec Lansing. A 7 voice of the theater speakers in good condition sells for $3,000 to $8,000. A pair of Model 19 home loudspeakers brings $3,000 to $6,000. Original 604 series duplex monitors command $2,000 to $5,000 a pair. Individual 515 woofers sell for $400 to $1,000 each. Individual 288 compression drivers bring 3 to 800. On any given day, eBay lists more than 800 vintage Altec speakers in the collectible audio category. The dead company's products are worth vastly more than the living brands. The most expensive product currently sold under the Altec Lansing name is a Bluetooth Party speaker that retails for approximately $200. It is manufactured by a toy and accessories company in New Jersey, assembled in a factory in southern China, and sold at Walmart. Altec Lansing is not alone in this fate. The pattern has repeated across the audio industry so many times it has its own logic, its own vocabulary, its own practitioners. Sansui, the great Japanese receiver manufacturer whose AU series integrated amplifiers were objects of desire for a generation of audiophiles, is now a brand licensed to an Indian company for air conditioners and budget televisions. Akai, which made the finest open-reel tape decks in the world, is a badge on products its founders wouldn't recognize. Nakamichi, whose cassette decks were engineering marvels that inspired something close to devotion, is a name on cheap Bluetooth speakers. Fisher, Acoustic Research, Marantz, before Harman rescued it. The list runs long and the trajectory is always the same. Acquire a legendary brand in distress. Eliminate the manufacturing operation and the engineering talent that created the legend. License the name to the lowest cost producer available. Extract licensing fees until the reservoir of consumer trust is fully depleted. Then move on. It isn't manufacturing. It's mining. Mining the trust that someone else spent decades building, extracting the last value from a reputation that took a lifetime to earn, and leaving nothing behind when the seam runs out. The Anaheim factory at 1515 South Manchester Avenue is gone. The site has been redeveloped. The Disneyland monorail still runs. The tourists still look out the windows. What they see now is not a building where Americans built loudspeakers by hand. What they see is whatever replaced it, which is not the point. The point is what isn't there. In Oklahoma City, the building at 10,500 West Reno Avenue still stands. It's not an Altec Lansing factory anymore. It hasn't been for more than 25 years. A few blocks away, at Great Plains Acoustics, the original tooling still turns. The original drawings are still consulted. The original methods are still followed. Bill Hanashak is still there. The work continues, in diminished form, in a building the tourists will never find, in a city most audiophiles couldn't locate on a map. In Milford, Pennsylvania, the Sparkomatic headquarters where Edward Anschel once ran a $100 million car stereo operation and then a computer speaker empire is quiet. The former employees who gathered at the brew pub in June 2022 are scattered now, working other jobs or retired, carrying the memory of a company that changed its name and its purpose so many times that the question of what it actually was depends entirely on when you ask. The Altec Lansing website today claims a heritage dating to 1927. It mentions Woodstock. It mentions the voice of the theater. It mentions decades of innovation. It does not mention Sparkomatic. It does not mention Soccer International. It does not mention that the products currently sold under the name are manufactured in Dongguan by a company that also makes toys and children's accessories. It does not mention that no one involved in building the current products has any connection to anyone who ever built a 604 duplex, or wound a voice coil in Anaheim, or tested a compression driver in Oklahoma City. The heritage page is real history in the service of something that no longer resembles what the history describes. It's a portrait of someone's grandfather, hung in a house he'd never recognize, used to sell furniture he'd never sit in. What was lost at Altec Lansing was not just a brand, and not just a product line, and not just 600 jobs in Anaheim, or the jobs that followed in Oklahoma City and Milford. What was lost was a particular kind of knowledge. The knowledge that lives in hands, not manuals. The ability to tap a cone and hear whether the suspension is right. The instinct for how much adhesive to apply to a voice coil former. The understanding accumulated across decades and passed from one generation of assemblers to the next of how a great loudspeaker actually comes into being. That knowledge doesn't survive corporate transactions. It doesn't transfer when a brand is licensed. It doesn't live in specification sheets or engineering drawings, no matter how carefully they're preserved. It lives in people. And when the people are sent home, it goes with them, and it doesn't come back. George Carrington saw the future of sound in a wartime submarine detector. James Lansing heard perfection in a speaker cone and couldn't live with a world that wouldn't let him build it. John Hilliard designed the voice of the theater because he believed that every seat in a movie palace deserved to hear the film the way the director intended. Bill Hanley drove those speakers to a dairy farm in upstate New York and made 400,000 people hear Jimi Hendrix. Bill Hanushak, when the factory closed and the tooling was declared surplus, loaded it onto trucks and kept building. Each of them, in their own way, believed the same thing, that the work mattered, that making something well was its own justification. Somewhere tonight in a jazz kissa in Tokyo, a pair of Altec Lansing, a 7 voice of the theater speakers, is filling a small room with the sound of a trumpet recorded 60 years ago on a microphone that ran through an Altec mixer, onto tape that was mastered on Altec 604 monitors. The sound is warm and immediate and startlingly alive. The speakers weigh 180 pounds each. They were built by hand in Anaheim, California, by someone whose name nobody wrote down, in a factory that no longer exists, for a company that no longer makes anything. The music plays, the speakers hold, the work remains, even after everything else is gone.